gospel lesson this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, the 6th chapter. Jesus came down from the mountain with them and stood on a large area of level ground. A great company of his disciples and a huge crowd of people from all around Judea and Jerusalem and the area around Tyre and Sidon joined him there. They came to hear him and to be healed from their diseases. And those bothered by unclean spirits were healed. The whole crowd wanted to touch him because power was going out from him and he was healing everyone. Jesus raised his eyes to his disciples and said, "Happy are you who are poor, because God's kingdom is yours. Happy are you who hunger now, because you will be satisfied. Happy are you who weep now, because you will laugh. Happy are you when people hate you, reject you, insult you, and condemn your name as evil because of the human one. Rejoice when that happens. Leap for joy, because you have a great reward in heaven. Your ancestors did the same things to the prophets. But how terrible for you who are rich, because you've already received your comfort. How terrible for you who have plenty now, because you will be hungry. How terrible for you who laugh now, because you will mourn and weep. How terrible for you when all speak well of you. Their ancestors did the same things to the false prophets." There's a story about a young boy who had just started taking piano lessons. His teacher would come to the home and give him a lesson on the piano that the family owned. The piano was one that was made by Wurlitzer, which was an old company that made not the top level of pianos and organs and so on, but they made ones that people often have in their homes. Well, when you're learning to play, you have to identify the keys on the keyboard, of course. And the teacher showed the boy in the very first lesson a shortcut. She said, "Now you have to find middle C. All you got to do is look, and the name of the piano is printed typically up above it. Wurlitzer, well, just look to the left of the W, and there you'll find middle C." Well, the boy learned that. And after taking lessons for a short while, he managed to learn one very simple piece. And the piano teacher, as teachers often did, would arrange for a recital for the parents of all her students so that they could all see that they were getting their money's worth, what they were paying for. Well, this boy, his proud parents and his grandparents were there in the audience, and the boy walked out in front of everybody with all the courage he could muster and sat down at the piano, ready to play the one piece he'd learned how to play, and he froze. Because the piano was a Yamaha.
Where's the W?
He missed something in the process of learning this, because what was supposed to be a shortcut, looking at this letter and finding middle C, was supposed to be a shortcut so that you could learn the real thing. Because the real thing is the keyboard, and you're supposed to look at the keyboard and find middle C, but he'd never gotten that far. Somebody changed the rules on him. Yeah. It depends where you look to get your cues in life. Whether you look at the simple thing that's in front of you that the world says is important, or whether you look at reality. I think in a way that's what Jesus is trying to get us to think about in the gospel lesson this morning. Not that it's about playing a piano, it's about much more important things in life. Because the world tells us that there are certain things that make life good and important and happy. And there are other things that you want to avoid. But Jesus flips everything on its head today in what you've read, or what we've read. Happy are you who are poor, who are hungry, who weep. Happy are you people reject you because of me. Watch out if you're rich. Watch out if you're comfortable. Watch out if everybody's saying good things about you. See, that's not the way we usually think about life, is it? Some of this sounds familiar to you. If it does, it's probably because you've heard it from another version of it. In Matthew's gospel, there's what we call the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew says Jesus takes a few of his disciples and some other people, a small group, up on top of a hill and gives them a long exposition of his teaching. Takes up 3 whole chapters in Matthew's gospel. Scholars can argue about whether it's really a verbatim transcript of a sermon that he gave or whether it's a collection of his saying, of his teaching, but it doesn't matter. Matthew pictures this as kind of spiritual teaching to a small group of people. And it's often noted that in Matthew's gospel, Jesus says things that are kind of directed internally. He talks about, blessed are the poor in spirit. Or he talks about those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. That's the Sermon on the Mount. What we have in Luke's gospel is what's sometimes called the Sermon on the Plain. And it's a very different kind of image. In fact, Luke says he comes down from the hill and a whole crowd gather around him. All kinds of people. Some of the people from Judea, in other words, Jewish people, but people from Tyre and Sidon who were foreigners. In other words, a big crowd. And they've come there not because they've gathered for a lot of spiritual instruction. They've gathered because Jesus is a celebrity, because he's a person of power, because it's said he can heal people. I kind of think of all the folks who gathered around the Eagles. We had one of the players was appearing yesterday at a sports store in Bloomington. They said people stood out in line overnight so they could get in and see this football player. People who come and do all kinds of things to get close to somebody. So this is a mixed crowd. It's not a group of people who intentionally gathered because they want to hear Jesus. And Jesus helps a lot of them and heals people and so on. But then he starts looking around the crowd and he starts saying things. Happy are you who are poor. Not poor in spirit or some other kind of spiritualized thing, but happy are you who are poor. Well, that could apply to just about everybody there. In that day and age, what we would consider the wealthy people were just a tiny portion of society, and even what we would consider middle-class people were maybe 10% or something. Most people were poor, not very far from not having enough to live on. So he looks around and goes, oh, happy are you who are poor. Happy are you who are hungry. Well, maybe there's a fellow over there. A lot of these people in that day were day laborers. You go a couple of days without work, maybe you don't know where your meal's coming from that night. You might, that's somebody right over there. Happy are you who weep. Maybe there's somebody over here who's come with all sorts of problems in a family. The people are fighting and she doesn't know what she's going to get when she comes back home. Happy are you when people reject you. Oh, maybe there's people there who know what it's like to be rejected. And then he says, watch out, those of you who are rich, or maybe off on the side there's a tax collector. Tax collecting wasn't a civil service kind of job back then. It was a way to get rich if you were crooked enough. Oh, maybe there's somebody standing over there who thinks, people don't like me, but I've got a pile of gold coins at home. I'm doing pretty well. Happy are you, watch out, those of you who have plenty now. Maybe there's a farmer over here who's just taken in his crops and he's filled his barn and he's thinking, boy, I'm doing pretty good with life. Next year I'm going to have to build a bigger barn. I can remodel my house. In another place, Jesus would tell a parable about a farmer like that. Watch out when everybody speaks well of you. Maybe down front there's one of the Pharisees, the leaders of the synagogue, the leaders of the community, and somebody who's looked up to by everybody and is very careful about his reputation and is standing there, thinking, I'm an important person in this community and everybody ought to be looking to me for guidance and that sort of thing. Jesus includes pretty much everybody in the crowd, one way or another. So what does it mean? Well, in fact, I think this is Jesus is trying to get people to think about where you get your cues in life. You're like the kid in the piano who's taking, the world tells us certain things are important, but then there's God's kingdom, which remember is what Jesus is always talking about, not a place, but the condition of the world when things were being done God's way, when life is being lived the way God wants it to be. Does Jesus really mean that it's a good thing for people not to have enough food to eat? A good thing for people to be suffering? I don't really think that's what Jesus is saying. Translation is kind of hard, you know. We're reading an English translation of something that's written in Greek, and Jesus was speaking in Aramaic to people, and words have different meanings. He doesn't mean you're supposed to be happy if you don't have enough food to eat at home. But maybe it's more like the Declaration of Independence. There's a life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think people skip that last part, the pursuit of happiness, because you don't. To us, happy is the people who are celebrating the Eagles up in Philadelphia, you know. But that's not what that means. Thomas Jefferson, who was writing that, was trying to say this new experiment is a place where people can pursue their own purpose in life. You're not going to be told by the government, by a king, by a church, by society who you ought to be and what you ought to live. You can find your own purpose in life. I think maybe Jesus is thinking something along those lines. That while those who don't have what the world says is important, may look to another place to get their cues in life. They may be much more open to understanding what he's talking about as God's kingdom. It's a different way of living and of being. And on the other hand, when he says how terrible it is for you, he isn't necessarily saying it's a bad thing to have enough food at home, or a bad thing to be comfortable, or even to be well thought of. But he's saying, watch out, because if you're depending on the pile of money you got at home, your bank account, if you're depending on what other people are thinking of you, watch out. You may be taking your cues in life from the wrong place. You may be looking at what the world says is good, and not about what God's kingdom is saying. What Jesus says can be kind of confusing. It's like the little kid sitting at the piano and thinking somebody changed the rules on me. You know, because he's changing the rules on what the world thinks about it, thinks about life. There's a story about a certain church that got a new pastor assigned to them. And a few weeks after the pastor arrived, the bishop's office got a call from the chair of the PPR committee saying, you got to get this guy out of here. He's got radical ideas. He's disturbing everybody. And when the bishop sent the district superintendent to find out what was going on, he discovered that that's past Sunday, the new young preacher had read the Beatitudes. And probably preached on it in a way that made some people in the congregation a little uncomfortable. You know, the earliest Christian creed is Jesus is Lord. Which means Jesus is in charge. If Jesus is Lord, then at a minimum, it means following his words as an example. But there's some people who don't want Jesus to be the starting point. They want the starting point to be what they want already, and kind of like the name of Jesus is a mascot, you know, for what they've already decided they want. Well, that's not what Jesus is challenging us to. Where do you get your orientation in life? Where do you look for your cues to where to start? I think this applies to the church as a collective as well as us as individuals. It'd be a great thing if the budget was fully funded and the treasurer didn't have to worry about how to get enough to pay all the bills, wouldn't it? It would be great if everything was going smoothly in the church. You never had any arguments or disagreements or problems to worry about. It'd be great if everyone spoke well of the church, if the church was a high point of the community and everybody thought the church was great, wouldn't it? Those are the things, but Jesus is warning, okay, but remember, that's the kind of thing the world says is important. It may not be the kingdom. How terrible when everybody speaks well of you. And their ancestors did that to the false prophets. Sometimes the church is tested as to where its orientation is coming from, where we as Christians find out what's most important. I know there's a lot of stuff going on in the news and the world today. Let me give you a really concrete example that may have slid under it isn't on the evening news as much. Catholic Charities, which is kind of the Catholic Church's equivalent of Encore, down in Texas runs a series of places called Annunciation House. They're basically a facility where people can come in and you get whatever you need. If you're hungry, they give you food. If you don't have clothing, they give you clothing. If you need medical care, they can connect you to a doctor or a nurse. If you need help making a phone call to relatives in some distant part of the country, they can work that out. And being on the border in Texas, obviously most of the people who come in are Spanish-speaking people, and the staff is a lot of bilingual people in there. And, well, their policy is they take whoever walks in the door and says they need something. They don't ask you about your politics or your religion or your immigration status, which is what has caused trouble. Because the state of Texas came down on them and said they wanted them to keep records of the immigration status of everybody they helped. And they said, no, we're not going to do it. And so the state of Texas shut them down. And it's now a court case. But the kind of important thing is, the state of Texas is saying in their legal argument that feeding people and clothing people and providing health care is not a religious activity. That's not Christian. They said, you're not really a Christian. What they counted up the number of church services. They occasionally have Spanish language church services for people. They counted up the number of church services they had and said, well, that's not enough to make your facility a religious place. They lost in the first round in court, but this is an ongoing thing. It's probably going to end up in the Supreme Court. And a number of other churches, including the United Methodist churches, have joined with the Catholics in defending this. But the point is, the government wants to define for the church what being the church is about. Feeding people and clothing people is not religious. Be careful when everybody speaks well of you. If you seek people speaking well of you, you may find yourself not doing what Jesus wants the church to be doing. Where do you get your orientation? Where's your starting point? Have you learned just one starting point from the world, like the kid sitting down at the piano and looking for the W? Or have we learned to look at the reality of God's kingdom, the way things really are, the way Jesus calls us to be, and take that as our place to learn how to live?